Hey, it's Ponch here. Great opportunity out of NATO connecting cognitive warfare to John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, and act loop. What they've done is they made this connection inside this document, and I'll give you a link to that here in a moment. But unfortunately, they describe the OODA loop as a basic 4-step. First you observe, then you orient, then you decide, then you act. And why this is wrong is the illustration that you see in front of you, one that you're going to find in this document, it overlooks these pathways. And what we've been saying for quite some time now is that the pathways are more important than what people call the phases, the OODA. I'm going to use the NATO document, the illustrations from that, to give you the ultimate hack to understanding cognitive warfare, and more importantly, making connections to things like artificial intelligence, platonic space, this huge argument on consciousness, things like category theory, constructor theory, constructal law, the Bayesian predictive processing. All of these things are only possible when you look at the OODA loop, the real OODA loop, through this simple hack. You can find this document on the NATO Science and Technology Organization webpage. I'll give you a link to that. You can go there, you can download it. And once you download it, you get about 24 pages of pretty good information on cognitive warfare. And you can see this document contains a lot of great illustrations, a lot of great points on cognitive warfare. And of course, they bring up the OODA loop several times. Now, before I get into that, I want to give you some background on who I am, what I do, where I'm coming from. First off, my background is in fighter aviation. I spent 16 years active, 12 years in the reserve, spent some time flying in the U.S. Navy. You end up learning a little bit about John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, act loop. In fact, you learn the linear aspect of it. I went on to retire as a Navy captain. I spent some time at NATO inside Ramstein, Germany at CC Air, one of the best jobs I ever had, tactical evaluation. I've also spent some time here in Norfolk speaking with NATO leaders on the concepts of complex adaptive systems. And of course, I've been overseas talking to NATO leaders about John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, and act loop. And unfortunately, I think they have the OODA loop wrong in this document, but we'll use that as a learning opportunity for all of us. First off, on page 6, in modern warfare, adversaries exploit vulnerabilities in the OODA loop, which they call a military decision-making framework. Now, the OODA loop is not necessarily a decision-making framework. I'm going to show you through this hack that it actually describes how living systems interact with their external environment. And I don't necessarily like the idea that it's a military decision-making framework. I don't think Boyd ever created it like that, but that's the way most people view the OODA loop. Now, anytime you write a NATO document or any document inside the military, you need to have an obligatory dead man quote. And in this case, it's from Sun Tzu. What's great about this is we've actually had an episode on No Way Out discussing the Sun Tzu, but the big connection here that NATO gets right is several elements of Sun Tzu's strategic thinking are captured in the OODA loop. Now, again, they make the point that it's a military decision-making OODA loop. That's not true. The OODA loop does contain a lot of influences from Sun Tzu. Another great thing about this paper coming out of NATO, they come up with this house model where they identify that we need to look at cognitive neuroscience and cognitive and behavioral sciences to understand what's going on in this world of cognitive warfare. They also bring up some great points about situational awareness and the technology enablers that are out there. But more importantly, they give us a solid definition of what cognitive warfare is. Now, cognitive warfare, we'll call it fifth generation warfare, psychological warfare, liminal warfare, or gray area warfare. And what that means is it's really overt and covert objectives below the threshold of war. So big surprise here, World War III is not in the future. You're living through World War III right now. It is a guerrilla information war. It is a cognitive war. We moved from wars of attrition to wars on cognition. The battlefield is your mind right now. So what they go on to say here is more about situational awareness. If you're targeting the orientation or the internal maps of your enemy or even your collaborators, you're degrading or improving their situational awareness. You're degrading their ability to make sense of the environment. You're degrading how individuals think, act, and make decisions. And I want to highlight two other things. This is happening at the conscious and subconscious levels, which you cannot describe through the linear OODA approach. So they do make a connection between the house model that I showed you previously and the OODA loop. And what they say is the house model is linked to the operational OODA military decision framework. Again, not a big fan of that phrase. The house model is linked to the OODA loop is a better phrase, as cognitive warfare can be viewed through the lens of how living systems interact with their environment. And I'm going to show you that hack here in a moment using NATO's illustration. Now, here's that illustration that's on page 15 in this document. I don't have any issues with this whatsoever. I think it's a great illustration of John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, and act loop. You can overlay John Boyd's original sketches of the OODA loop, and it looks very much the same. And of course, if you're familiar with John Boyd's real OODA loop, which this image shows, you'll see that they're very, very similar. So let me go back to that. I don't have any issues with this depiction of the OODA loop. I think it's quite good. Where I do have druthers, and I think you should too, is here at the bottom of page 15. It goes into the OODA loop is a means for understanding the decision-making process through a 4-step approach. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what they're saying. And I'm going to highlight this again. What about this over here? And what about this? And down here, we have these feedback loops or feedback pathways. We have this thing over here too called feedforward. There's many aspects of the OODA loop that the 4-step process disregards. So it's unfortunate that they have this description, but we're going to use this as a positive because I'm going to give you the ultimate OODA loop hack that anybody can use to understand cognitive warfare. And of course, a lot of things that I'll show you here in a moment. So the next druther I have is they go into the phases of the OODA loop. Observe. You observe data collection phase from multiple sources. Well, not necessarily. You're going to find out through this OODA loop hack that observations is not a passive thing. You're going to find out that this is actually a living system interacting with its environment. So let's go ahead and dive into that now. So here's the ultimate hack. It goes something like this. Put a boundary around it. Separate the internal states from the external states. It's that simple. Now, let me give you some background on where this idea is coming from. So one of the first places I refer folks to is years ago when looking at Michael Pollan's work, understanding PTSD, TBI, diving into the world of psychedelic assisted therapies, I came up with about 70 pages of ideas in here from the edge of consciousness to the consciousness edge, what Top Guns can teach us about reality, trauma, and psychedelic assisted therapy. This is a draft. It goes into what I call the entropic OODA loop. It's just a boundary. Goes into the history of the OODA loop, Boyd's work on the aerial attack study, EM theory, goes on into the discourse in winning and losing, destruction and creation. But more importantly, it makes connections to the entropic brain hypothesis, or the reduced belief under psychedelics model, which came from Robin Carhart Harris. And this is one of the first places that influenced me to put Boyd's OODA loop within a boundary. Now, that's not the only place that has this type of influence. This is Franklin Chuck Spinney. In 1983, he was on the cover of Time magazine. Billions being wasted in U.S. defense spending. Have you heard this recently? That's from 1983. So here's this Chuck Spinney working with a gentleman by the name of John Boyd. Several years later, about 12, 13 years later, they work together, collaborate on actually sketching John Boyd's Observe, Orient, Decide, Act loop. So the OODA loop was not sketched until about 1995 when Chuck Spinney, John Boyd, and Chet Richards start working on that. But this brief that Chuck Spinney has, it's been updated several times. The evolutionary epistemology, personal view of John Boyd's destruction and creation. For those of you who haven't read Destruction and Creation and think they're familiar with John Boyd's OODA loop, you're probably wrong. You need to go look at Destruction and Creation. It is the most important aspect of John Boyd's OODA loop. Now, in this brief, here's what Chuck Spinney points out. Boyd's OODA loop is an organic conception of how the mind operates. All right, it's an organic conception of how the mind operates. Mind doesn't work in a linear process. We know that now. But in this brief, he identifies that living organisms are interacting with their environments. And what he does in this brief is he puts a boundary. You can see that green area, if you will, and he identifies that there are only 2 points within the OODA loop that come into contact with reality, or what we call the environment. And those 2 points are observation in action. That's this boundary within the OODA loop sketch that separates internal states from external states. The problem with this particular illustration is it is a closed system, right? So what we want to do is we want to make it into an open system, which I'll show you here in a moment. But this closed system is often described when people say, first you observe, then you orient, then you decide, and then you act. That's not true, right? And for those of you familiar with the latest and greatest out of neuroscience and physics and quantum mechanics and all that, you'll know that you don't have a closed system interacting with the external world. So what we want to do is we want to open up that system. And I'll show you how to do that here in a moment. Organizations that are talking about agentic AI and large language models use the bad OODA loop to describe what their system does, right? First they observe, and they orient, and they decide, and then they act. Great. That's a great model for a engineering approach. It's not a great model for how living systems interact with the environment. So what we're seeing in AI are companies that are leaning towards natural intelligence approaches, which John Boyd's real OODA loop represents. So we're going to see a shift in 2026 away from these large language models, this OODA loop inspired agentic approach to AI towards a real OODA loop approach to AI. And hopefully you'll see that here as we go forward. Now, going back to our agent environment relationship, we have the agent, we have the internal states, we have the external states. What we do is we open up an inlet over here and an outlet. And what that does, it creates a flow system. You have a boundary, you have an inlet, and you have an outlet, a basic flow system. Now, that currency that flows through that could be oil, it could be gas. In this case, it's going to be information. Information is a currency that's flowing through our OODA loop. Now, that information can come in the form of energy or vibration, some type of sacred geometry, something connected to the Platonic space that people are starting to discuss more and more, and huge connections to this thing over here called outside information. We'll save that for a later discussion, though. All right, so basic flow system, agent, environment, some type of currency flowing through that, and of course, design. What is the minimum design necessary to understand natural intelligence? So on the environment, John Boyd identified several invariants, several things that we just cannot get rid of in the environment. He did this in the late 80s, early 90s, and he identified things like entropy. John Boyd's OODA loop is really inspired by the second law of thermodynamics. He talks about ambiguity, novelty. Some people call this VUCA, right? John Boyd identified these features. In fact, he said there is no way to eliminate these features. There is no way out. And that's where we get the title of the podcast, No Way Out. We have to go through this whirl of reorientation. So let's move on. So here's the hack. You have a boundary, you have this inlet, you have this outlet. We're going to call them sensory states and active states. Your sensory states are nothing more than your sensory organs. So sensory states and active states sit on the boundary, and they're the only two contact points an agent has with the external environment. So this black box, and I hate to call it a black box, but this is orientation. It's an internal model of the external world. It's based on three core components: genetics, culture, and experiences. Now, there's a fourth component of this called new information, or what we call surprise. John Boyd called it mismatches, but within his OODA loop, he called it new information. And that new information is streaming or coming in from your sensory organs or your sensory states, right? Your observations are just sending information, and new information only to your internal model of the external world. One of the key components that many people overlook with John Boyd's OODA loop is this blue area over here. This is perception. Perception is constructed top down, inside out. If you follow Andy Clark or Anil Seth, you'll know that they say that perception is a controlled hallucination. Your perception is top down, inside out. It's a controlled hallucination. Don't worry about that too much. It just means that we do not passively experience the world. Now, you'll see here in the green area between the perception and action loop, if you will. For those of you familiar with ecological dynamics, there's your perception and action loop connected to the external world, which you call affordances. It's already in there, but it goes through this green area that John Boyd called implicit guidance and control. This area is really about intuition, technical and non-technical skills. It's a good process. There are no best practices. They're just good practices, good processes. We have to go through this cycle of destruction and creation to improve upon these all the time. So for those of you in ecological dynamics, Boyd's OODA loop gives you something really valuable to talk about when it comes to building your technical and non-technical skills. So again, nice connection to the ecological dynamics, huge connection to type 0 and type 1 cognition, maybe system 1 thinking. But anyway, many people overlook that when they talk about John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, and act loop. The next area is predictive processing, or the Bayesian brain. I won't go too deep into this, but there's an area inside Boyd's OODA loop that represents this predictive aspect, that humans or living systems are prediction machines, that we go through this Bayesian processing, if you will, of how we anticipate what's coming next, closing the gap between what's predicted and the new information coming in from the external world. Or for those of you familiar with the free energy principle, we're trying to minimize surprise. The last part within the OODA loop, within the internal states, is fed by how well we plan, how well our models of the internal world are aligned to the external world. And we feed that into planning. Planning is continuous. It's not something you do once. It's continuous. We run simulations. We run counterfactuals, which are what-if scenarios. This is the active part, or one of the active parts of active inference, for those of you who are familiar with that. But you can see here, John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, act loop, when looked through the lens of how living systems interact with the external world, it starts to connect seemingly disparate ideas. So let's put it all back together. Taking the illustration that NATO gave us, I didn't change anything on here. I just put a boundary around it, right? And once you put that boundary on it and you look at the pathways and move away from this idea that there are phases of the OODA loop, that these phases are really sensory states, active states, and this thing called orientation. Decision is still important, but it's not as important. It's still part of the OODA loop, but this is what you end up with. You end up understanding perception, intuition, which John Boyd called Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel, technical, non-technical skills, how we deal with that, how we adapt to the external environment, predictive processing, the Bayesian brain, planning, simulation, counterfactuals. All these things are going on within a cell, a neuron, our mind, an organ in our body, us as entities, us as teams, organizations, political parties. This is a fractal approach to how living systems interact with your external environment. It's a very powerful tool to understand, especially if we're talking about cognitive warfare. So I made a few connections earlier. Hey, if you understand this, you'll start to see the connections between things like perceptual control theory, Bayesian brain, active inference, constructor theory, constructal law, which is a fantastic law about flow systems, category theory. We might even have conversations about consciousness if we understand the OODA loop through this lens. And one of my favorite aspects at the moment is looking into this idea coming from biology that there's this platonic space out there, which is based off of platonic solids and things like that. Of course, you wouldn't get to that if you followed the OODA loop as an observe, orient, decide, act, four-phase approach. For those of you who are familiar with flow, the concept of flow, let's take this new way of looking at the OODA loop for a test drive, right? What does this mean now? What can I do with it? So there's this challenge skills ratio or matrix or chart that we want to look at, where in the vertical, you have the external environment, the challenges that are in the external environment. And we compare that with the skills in the internal system, or what the agent has internally that's captured through the implicit guidance control pathway and John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, act loop. So the idea here is you want to find some type of balance between the skill level and the challenge. We always want to be challenged when we're trying to find a flow state. One of the reasons, people like to perform music or do stand-up comedy, play sports, do yoga, breathing exercises, meditate, all these things. You want to find some type of environment where the challenges of the environment are a little bit stronger than your internal skills. That's how we get better. But there's this flow channel in the middle there that we want to kind of stay in. So if we're in an environment where we have the challenges of the environment are greater than our skill level, we get into some stress, some anxiety, we feel a little frustrated. Over here on the bottom side of this, if we're if our skills are greater than the challenges in the environment, we're going to get bored. We're going to relax. We're going to get a little complacent, right? So we want to go through cycles of destruction and creation, build up our skills, and to meet the challenges of the external environment. So how does this relate to the OODA loop? Well, remember what I said about the perception action loop right here. Within the perception action loop that connects to the external world, you want to build those technical, those non-technical skills, that intuitive sense of how to deal with a changing environment. And that's what the OODA loop provides us when we, in the context of perception action or ecological dynamics, is it says, this is what we need to build up here because it's a lower energy approach than doing the deliberate approaches down in here. And this space up here gives us access to outside information. And that's where novelty comes from. Again, I'm giving you just a high level overview of one way to look at this new way to hack the OODA loop. And that is when you build that green space up, that implicit guidance control up in your OODA loop, you start to move up and to the right in this flow channel. Hopefully it's in the flow channel. If you find yourself over here, that means you don't have the skills necessary to work in that challenging environment. So you want to move back in this direction if you can by building up your skills. And over here, this says your skills are greater than the environment that you're working in. So you can see that in peak performance in sports, we want to kind of zigzag on our way up there over time. We're coming close to Super Bowl time here in the US. So we have some sports teams that are up here. And that's always great for us to watch as observers, to watch those people play high performing sports. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of this. Again, I just wanted to share that the cognitive warfare document that NATO put out is pretty solid. Unfortunately, their description of John Boyd's OODA loop is wrong. I hope they can correct that at some point in the future. They're more than welcome to call us and say, what do you mean by this? There's plenty of opportunity to learn more and more about the connection between John Boyd's work and things that are happening in neuroscience, physical science, natural intelligence, cognitive science, you name it. So, hey, I'm Ponch. Make sure you subscribe and like to No Way Out. Share that with a friend. Subscribe and like Substack, The World of Reorientation. And I hope you have a awesome 2026.